"Officer, before you put those cuffs on me, you should verify my name." The man standing beneath the courthouse lights did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply looked at Officer Sterling Davis and gave him one final opportunity to stop. But Sterling Davis had already made up his mind. Robert Franklin stood in an immaculate white U.S. Navy dress uniform, silver insignia catching the morning light, every detail of his appearance reflecting years of discipline and service. To the people passing through the courthouse entrance, he looked like a distinguished military officer on official business. To Sterling Davis, he was simply another black man who, in his opinion, needed to explain why he was there. "Hands behind your back," Sterling said. Robert slowly turned his hands as instructed. "Officer, I have already shown you my identification." Sterling barely glanced at it. "I said hands behind your back." The surrounding hallway became strangely quiet. A few visitors stopped walking. Someone lowered their phone. Nobody understood why a uniformed Navy officer was being treated like a suspect. Robert remained composed. That calmness seemed to irritate Sterling even more. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," Sterling muttered. Robert heard the words clearly. So did several people nearby. For a moment, his expression changed, not into anger, but disappointment. He looked down at the polished gold buttons on his white uniform, then back at the officer standing in front of him. "I'm giving you an opportunity to verify what you're doing," Robert said. Sterling gave a short, dismissive laugh. "I don't need a lecture." Then came the sound Robert had been trying to prevent. Click. The handcuffs were secured around his wrists. Robert did not resist. He did not make a scene. He simply stood there, straight-backed and silent, while Sterling announced that he was being detained for questioning. What Sterling did not know was that Robert Franklin had spent decades learning the value of patience. He also did not know that Robert had a reason for not making a phone call that could have ended this situation in seconds. Robert could have identified his rank. He could have contacted the naval base. He could have demanded immediate assistance. Instead, he said nothing, because there was something Robert needed to see, something he needed to understand. And Sterling Davis was about to show him exactly how far he was willing to go when he believed no one powerful was watching. What Sterling did not realize was that someone was watching. And before that morning was over, the white uniform he had ignored would become the most important thing in the entire courthouse. Why would Navy Admiral refuse to make one phone call that could end this entire situation? That was the question Sterling Davis would never think to ask. 45 minutes earlier, Robert Franklin had been driving away from the naval base on a quiet Virginia morning, his white dress uniform neatly pressed beneath his dark overcoat. He had just completed a private meeting with senior officers and was heading toward the courthouse for an appointment that had nothing to do with his rank. There was no convoy, no military escort, no flashing lights announcing his arrival. Just one black sedan moving through ordinary morning traffic. Then Sterling Davis saw him. The patrol car pulled behind Robert's vehicle, and moments later, the familiar red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Robert checked his speedometer. He had been driving within the posted limit. Still, he calmly pulled to the curb. Sterling approached the driver's window with a serious expression. "License and registration." Robert handed them over. Sterling studied the documents, then looked back at Robert. "Where are you headed?" "The county courthouse." "Why?" Robert paused. "I have an appointment." Sterling looked at the white uniform beneath Robert's coat. His eyes lingered on the insignia, but instead of asking about it, he asked another question. "You military?" "Yes." "What branch?" "Navy." Sterling nodded slowly, but there was no sign that the answer satisfied him. "Step out of the vehicle." Robert opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The morning air was cool, and traffic moved steadily behind them. Robert remained respectful. "Officer, may I ask what this is?" "About?" Sterling said he needed to verify Robert's identity. Robert reached into his wallet and presented his military identification. Sterling looked at the card for only a moment before handing it back. "Could be anyone's." Robert stared at him quietly. "You can verify it." I said I will handle it. That was the moment Robert understood this was no longer about a simple traffic stop. Something else was happening. Something he had seen before, not personally, but in reports brought to his attention over the years, he could have ended the encounter immediately. One call to the base would have brought senior officers to the scene. But Robert deliberately kept his phone in his pocket. He wanted to know what Sterling Davis would do when he believed the person standing before him had no influence, no protection, and no one important waiting behind him. Sterling reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I have a subject here who refuses to cooperate." Robert heard the statement and slowly looked toward the courthouse in the distance. He said nothing, because sometimes the most revealing test of a person's character is what they do when they believe nobody can hold them accountable. Sterling Davis had already seen the identification. What he had not yet realized was that the uniform in front of him was telling him the truth. Robert Franklin stood beside the patrol car, his white navy dress uniform bright against the gray morning sky. The gold buttons were perfectly aligned. His insignia was unmistakable to anyone familiar with naval rank. Yet Sterling continued to treat the uniform as though it were nothing more than a costume. "Where exactly did you say you were going?" Sterling asked again. "The courthouse," Robert replied. "And why are you wearing a Navy uniform there?" Robert looked at him calmly. "Because I am attending an official meeting." Sterling folded his arms. "That doesn't answer my question." Robert could hear traffic moving behind him, tires passing over the damp pavement, distant voices drifting from the courthouse entrance. Everything around them felt ordinary. But the encounter itself was becoming anything but ordinary. Robert reached into his pocket once more and carefully produced his military identification. "Officer Davis, you can verify my identity through your department or contact the base." Sterling took the card. This time, he studied it for several seconds. Then he handed it back. "I'll decide what needs to be verified." Robert nodded. "Understood." That single word seemed to irritate Sterling. He expected resistance. He expected anger. Instead, Robert remained composed. For a man accustomed to command, Robert knew the difference between authority and ego. He also knew that the fastest way to understand someone was to give them room to reveal themselves. Sterling glanced again at the insignia on Robert's chest. "You expect me to believe you're some kind of high-ranking officer?" Robert did not answer immediately. His eyes moved toward the courthouse. "I expect you to verify the facts." Sterling smiled. "You're not in charge here." Robert looked back at him. "I never said I was." A few seconds passed. Then Sterling asked Robert to place his hands where he could see them. Robert complied. A woman walking toward the courthouse slowed down and watched from a distance. Another person near the entrance looked over, noticing the unmistakable Navy uniform. Robert remained perfectly still. There was no argument, no raised voice, just a quiet man allowing an officer to make his own choices. And that was precisely what made the moment so important. Robert knew the uniform represented more than his personal rank. It represented years of service, responsibility, and trust. But Sterling seemed determined to see only what he wanted to see. He picked up his radio again. "I'm bringing him in for further verification." Robert finally looked directly into Sterling's eyes. "Before you do that, Officer Davis, I want you to remember one thing." Sterling waited. Robert's voice remained calm. "You have been given several opportunities to verify who I am." Then he fell silent. Sterling opened the rear door of the patrol car. Robert did not move. Not yet, because the next decision would tell Robert everything he needed to know about the man standing in front of him. The moment Robert Franklin realized Sterling Davis would not stop was the moment he decided to stop helping him. The words never left Robert's mouth. He simply stood there, calm and composed, watching the officer make one decision after another. Sterling opened the rear door of the patrol car. "Get inside." Robert looked at the vehicle, then back at Sterling. "Officer Davis, I have cooperated with every instruction you have given me." Sterling's expression hardened. "Then cooperate with this one." Robert took a slow breath. He could have reached for his phone. He could have made one call. He could have identified himself by rank and ended the encounter before another minute passed. But he chose not to. Instead, he stepped toward the vehicle. The white uniform remained immaculate, even after the long morning. The insignia on his chest caught the sunlight for a brief moment, but Sterling did not seem interested. To him, The details did not matter. The questions mattered only as long as he controlled them. As Robert sat down, Sterling began filling out paperwork. Name: Robert Franklin. Occupation. Robert paused. United States Navy. Sterling looked up. Rank. Robert met his eyes. You can verify it. Sterling shook his head. I'm asking you. Robert answered calmly. Rear Admiral. For the first time, Sterling stopped writing. His eyes moved toward the insignia on Robert's uniform. The pause lasted only a moment. Then his expression returned to the same confidence. We'll verify that. Robert nodded. That's all I've asked you to do. Sterling closed the door and walked toward the front of the vehicle. Robert sat quietly in the back seat, looking through the window at the courthouse across the street. He knew that what happened next would matter. Not because he needed to prove that he outranked the officer. Not because he wanted special treatment. It mattered because every person in a position of authority eventually faces a choice. Follow the facts or follow their assumptions. Sterling had been given that choice repeatedly, and every time he had chosen his assumptions. A few minutes later, another officer approached the patrol car. His name was Sergeant James Carter. He glanced inside and immediately noticed the white uniform. His expression changed. Sterling, he said quietly. Who exactly do you have back there? Sterling shrugged. A subject I'm verifying. Carter looked through the window again. This time, he focused on the insignia. Did you check his credentials? We're handling it. Carter hesitated. You might want to check them again. Sterling turned toward him. I said we're handling it. Carter stepped back, but his eyes remained on Robert. Robert gave him a small nod. Nothing more. No explanation. No request for help. That quiet gesture stayed with Carter as he walked away. Inside the car, Robert looked down at his hands. He knew the situation had crossed an important line, but he also knew something else. Sterling still had no idea who was waiting for the phone call that Robert had deliberately refused to make. And when that phone finally rang, the entire situation would change. The phone call Robert Franklin refused to make was finally made by someone else. Inside the patrol station, the atmosphere had begun to change. Sterling Davis sat behind a desk reviewing the paperwork, still convinced the situation was nothing more than a routine verification. Robert remained in the waiting area, his posture straight, his white Navy uniform drawing occasional glances from officers passing through the room. He had not complained. He had not demanded special treatment. Most importantly, he had not used his rank to pressure anyone. But Sergeant James Carter could not stop thinking about what he had seen. He walked back towards Sterling's desk. I checked the insignia, Carter said quietly. Sterling looked up. And it appears legitimate. Sterling leaned back. We haven't confirmed anything yet. Carter lowered his voice. Then maybe we should. Sterling frowned. I'll handle it. Carter hesitated, then walked away. A few minutes later, the station phone rang. Sterling answered without much interest. Davis. A woman's voice came through the line. This is Chief Petty Officer Elena Brooks. I'm trying to locate Admiral Robert Franklin. Sterling glanced toward the waiting area. What? There was a brief pause. Because he was expected at the courthouse 20 minutes ago. Sterling looked at the clock. Then he looked through the glass toward Robert. He's here. Elena became silent for a moment. He's where? At the station. Her voice changed immediately. Why is Admiral Franklin at your station? Sterling straightened slightly. We're verifying his identity. Another pause. Then Elena asked a simple question. Did you verify his military identification? Sterling looked down at the paperwork. We're in the process. Officer Davis, Elena said calmly, that identification could be verified in less than a minute. Sterling's confidence began to fade, but he still tried to maintain control. We'll contact the appropriate office. Elena replied, You should do that now. The call ended. Sterling stared at the phone for several seconds. Across the room, Robert remained silent. He had heard enough to know the situation was changing. Sergeant Carter approached him carefully. Admiral Franklin, I apologize for the confusion. Robert looked at him. Don't apologize for something you didn't do. Carter nodded, visibly relieved by the response. Then he asked, Sir, why didn't you tell Officer Davis your rank when he first stopped you? Robert looked toward the hallway. I did. Carter frowned. You told him? Yes. Robert's voice remained steady. Several times. Carter glanced towards Sterling's desk. Suddenly, the entire situation seemed different. This was no longer a question of whether Robert could prove who he was. He had already done that. The real question was why his identification had been ignored. Sterling finally stood and walked toward Robert. For the first time, the confidence in his face was gone. Admiral Franklin, he began, choosing each word carefully. We're just trying to clear up a misunderstanding. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Then let's clear it up with the facts. Sterling said nothing, because somewhere outside that room, another call was already being made. And this time, it was going directly to Robert Franklin's commanding officer. The moment Sterling Davis realized Robert Franklin was an admiral was not the moment he became afraid. It was the moment he realized the admiral had known exactly what he was doing all along. The station had grown unusually quiet. Officers moved between desks. Phones rang in distant rooms, and a low hum of fluorescent lights filled the hallway. Robert remained seated, his white navy dress uniform standing out against the ordinary surroundings. Sterling stood several feet away, holding the paperwork he had been so confident about only minutes earlier. Sergeant James Carter was nearby, watching everything carefully. Then Elena Brooks arrived at the station. She entered carrying a small folder and stopped when she saw Robert. Admiral Franklin. Robert stood. Chief. Elena looked towards Sterling, then back at Robert. Are you all right? I'm Fina. She nodded, but her expression remained serious. Your meeting at the courthouse started 27 minutes ago. Robert glanced at his watch. I know. Sterling stepped forward. There was a misunderstanding during a traffic stop. Elena looked at him. A misunderstanding that resulted in an admiral being detained. Sterling did not answer immediately. Robert calmly raised one hand. Chief, let's not make assumptions. Elena stopped. Robert turned towards Sterling. Let the facts speak for themselves. That sentence changed the atmosphere. Sergeant Carter looked at Robert with a new understanding. The admiral was not trying to escape responsibility. He was not demanding that anyone use his rank to protect him. He was asking for the same thing he had requested from the beginning, verification. Elena opened the folder. Admiral, there is another reason I came here. Robert looked at her. Go ahead. The base received several reports over the last year involving service members who were stopped near this area and said they felt they were treated differently because of their appearance or military status. Sterling immediately interrupted. Are you suggesting I? Robert looked at him. Nobody is suggesting anything. Sterling stopped. Robert continued. That's why I didn't make the call earlier. Carter looked confused. Sir. Robert turned toward him. I wanted to see what happened when nobody knew who I was. The room went silent. Sterling stared at him. You were testing me. Robert shook his head. No, I was observing you. Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. Robert explained that he had been reviewing concerns about interactions between military personnel and local law enforcement. He had not come looking for trouble. He had simply wanted to understand whether the reports reflected isolated misunderstandings or something more consistent. Sterling looked toward the floor. Admiral, I followed procedure. Robert answered quietly. Then the records will show that. No anger, no threat, just certainty. At that moment, Elena's phone vibrated. She checked the screen and looked up. Sir, your commanding officer is on his way. Robert nodded once. Sterling's expression changed again. He had spent the morning believing he was the person in control. Now he was waiting for someone who outranked even the man he had detained. And when that commanding officer walked through the station doors, Sterling Davis was about to discover that the biggest mistake of his morning had not been detaining Robert Franklin. It had been assuming Robert had nobody behind him. Everyone in that station thought the situation was about to end. They were wrong. It was only beginning. The front doors opened, and the atmosphere inside the station changed almost instantly. Conversations became quieter. Officers looked toward the entrance as a senior Navy officer stepped inside, dressed in a dark service uniform, his expression calm and unmistakably serious. Behind him came two additional officers from the base. Sterling Davis straightened in his chair. Sergeant James Carter recognized the insignia immediately. "That's Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker," he whispered. Sterling looked at him. "Vice Admiral?" Carter nodded. "Admiral Franklin's commanding officer." For several seconds, nobody moved. Thomas Whitaker walked across the room without rushing. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a dramatic entrance. He simply approached Robert Franklin and stopped. "Admiral." Robert stood. "Sir." Whitaker looked at Robert's wrists, then at Sterling. His expression remained controlled. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir." Whitaker nodded. Then he turned toward Sterling. "Officer, I understand there was an issue involving Admiral Franklin." Sterling cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. There was a traffic stop, and we needed to verify his identity." Whitaker listened without interrupting. "And how did you verify it?" Sterling hesitated. "We were in the process." Whitaker glanced at Robert. "Did he provide identification?" "Yes, sir." "Military identification?" "Yes." Whitaker paused. "And did you contact the Navy to verify it?" Sterling looked down. "Not initially." The room became silent. Whitaker did not react immediately. Instead, he asked another question. "Did Admiral Franklin identify himself by rank?" Sterling nodded. "Yes." Whitaker looked directly at him. "Then why was he detained?" Sterling began explaining that Robert had appeared suspicious and that the situation required further verification. Whitaker listened carefully. He did not interrupt. When Sterling finished, Whitaker simply said, "All right." Then he turned to Sergeant Carter. "Sergeant, is there body camera footage from the initial stop?" Carter answered, "Yes, sir." "Please preserve it." Sterling looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I assure you, there was no—" Whitaker raised one hand, stopping him without hostility. "Officer, I am not here to decide what happened before seeing the facts." He looked toward the camera system. "I am here to make sure the facts are preserved." Robert remained silent. He knew this was exactly how accountability was supposed to work. No shouting, no threats, no special treatment, just facts. Whitaker then turned toward Robert. "Admiral, did you contact me?" Robert shook his head. "No, sir." Whitaker looked surprised. "Why not?" Robert answered quietly. "Because I wanted to see whether my uniform would matter." Whitaker studied him for a moment. "And—" Robert looked toward Sterling. "It didn't." The words settled over the room. Sterling lowered his eyes. For the first time that morning, he seemed to understand what Robert had been trying to show him. This was never about whether Robert deserved respect, because he was an admiral. It was about whether a person deserved dignity before anyone knew their rank. Whitaker turned back toward Sterling. "Officer Davis, we're going to review the footage, the identification records, and the report." A pause. "Then we'll determine exactly what happened." Sterling nodded quietly. Robert watched without satisfaction. He did not need revenge. The evidence would speak for itself. And as the body camera footage was prepared, Sterling still did not realize that the recording would reveal far more than one questionable detention. It would reveal every choice he had made when he believed nobody important was watching. The footage did not just show what Sterling Davis had done that morning. It showed what he had been willing to ignore. The room became completely still as the body camera recording began. Robert Franklin remained seated beside Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker, his expression calm. Sterling stood near the desk, watching the screen with growing discomfort. The recording began with a traffic stop. Sterling's voice filled the room. The same questions, the same assumptions, the same dismissive tone. Then came the moment Robert presented his military identification. The footage clearly showed the card being handed over. It showed Sterling looking at it. It showed him returning it without verifying the information. Nobody spoke. The recording continued. Robert heard himself saying, "You can verify it." Then Sterling's response played through the room. "I'll decide what needs to be verified." Sergeant Carter looked towards Sterling. Sterling said nothing. The footage continued to the moment Robert identified himself as a rear admiral. Again, there was silence. Vice Admiral Whitaker watched without changing his expression. When the recording ended, he turned towards Sterling. "Is there anything on that recording you believe is inaccurate?" Sterling swallowed and shook his head. "No, sir." Whitaker nodded. "Then we have a starting point." But the real surprise came next. Chief Petty Officer Elena Brooks placed a folder on the table. Inside were several prior complaints involving encounters between Sterling and members of the local military community. None had been proven at that moment, but the similarities were difficult to ignore. In several cases, service members reported that their identification had been dismissed or that they were treated with unusual suspicion before their credentials were properly checked. Sterling looked at the folder. Those were misunderstandings. Robert finally spoke. Then the investigation will determine that. His voice was calm. He was not accusing Sterling. He was not celebrating. He was simply allowing the process to work. Vice Admiral Whitaker turned toward the station supervisor. Preserve every related record. Body camera footage, reports, dispatch logs, and prior complaints. The supervisor nodded. Sterling realized the situation had become much larger than one morning beside a patrol car. His actions had created a record. That record would now be reviewed. And for the first time, Sterling understood the difference between being questioned and being held accountable. Robert stood and adjusted the sleeve of his white uniform. Whitaker looked at him. You could have ended this in 30 seconds. Robert nodded. I know. Why didn't you? Robert looked towards Sterling before answering. Because if my rank had been enough to change his behavior, we would have learned nothing. The room went quiet again. Robert continued. I wanted to know what happened when the person in front of him was simply a black man asking to be treated according to the facts. Sterling lowered his eyes. That sentence changed everything. Robert had not used his power to demand respect. He had allowed Sterling to reveal whether respect existed without it. And now the consequences would not be based on Robert being an admiral. They would be based on evidence, procedure, and accountability. Sterling had spent the morning believing he had control over the situation. By the afternoon, he was facing an investigation into every decision he had made. The cuffs had lasted minutes. The record they created could last much longer. And that was the karma Sterling Davis never saw coming. The most powerful thing Robert Franklin did that day was not use his rank. It was refuse to let his rank become the reason anyone received justice. By the end of the afternoon, the atmosphere inside the station had completely changed. The same hallway where Robert had stood in handcuffs that morning was now quiet, with officers moving carefully around the investigation that had begun. Sterling Davis had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal review. The body camera footage had been preserved. The dispatch records had been secured. The earlier complaints were being examined. For the first time, the questions were no longer being asked by Sterling. They were being asked about Sterling. Robert stood near the entrance in his white Navy dress uniform, the same uniform that had been ignored only hours earlier. Vice Admiral Thomas Whitaker approached him. Are you sure you don't want to file a personal complaint? Robert looked toward the station. I want the facts documented. Whitaker nodded. And if the investigation finds misconduct? Robert answered without hesitation. Then the proper process should handle it. Whitaker studied him for a moment. You could have ended this immediately. Robert gave a faint smile. That's exactly why I didn't. Elena Brooks joined them. Sir, the courthouse is still waiting for you. Robert checked his watch. Then I suppose I'm already late. Elena smiled. Before Robert left, Sergeant James Carter approached. He stood respectfully in front of the Admiral. Sir, may I say something? Robert nodded. Carter took a breath. I was there when it happened. I should have spoken up sooner. Robert looked at him. You did what mattered when you realized something was wrong. Carter nodded. Still, I wish I had done more. Robert placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Then do more next time. Carter understood. It was not a criticism. It was a challenge. A reminder that accountability was not only about the person who crossed the line. It was also about the people who witnessed it and decided whether silence was easier. Robert turned toward the courthouse. The sunlight reflected across his white uniform as he walked away. The insignia on his chest was visible from across the street, but now it meant something different. It was not a symbol that made him more deserving of respect. It was a symbol of responsibility. Behind him, Sterling remained inside the station, facing an investigation that had begun with one traffic stop and grown into something much larger. The officer had believed he was dealing with a man who had no power. Instead, He had revealed how he treated someone before knowing their power. And that was the real lesson. Robert Franklin did not walk away demanding revenge. He walked away knowing the truth had been documented, the process had begun, and others might finally have a chance to be heard. He had been handcuffed for minutes, but the consequences of those minutes could change much more than his morning. Sterling thought the uniform made Robert important. He was wrong. Robert was important because of the character behind it. And as the Admiral disappeared into the courthouse, one final truth remained. A badge can give someone authority. A uniform can represent service. But neither one can replace character. When power is abused, justice does not always arrive with anger. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, carrying the truth. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.